Now, a lot of us know who Gideon is. We find Gideon, if you want to follow along tonight, we're going to be in Judges chapter 7. Last week we were in Judges chapter 6. And Gideon, it lives in the promised land. So Moses, the Israelites under Moses did not get to go into the promised land. Most of you probably know that. Joshua gets to lead them into the promised land. And now they've dwelled there for a little while. And if you read the whole book of Judges, it's just like the worst thing ever, right? There are just terrible things going on in Judges. The end of Judges talks about how there was no king in those days in Israel, and the last verse is essentially every man did that which was right in his own eyes, right? And there was just no governing, they all just did what was right in their own eyes. Well, what they were doing is as they walked into this promised land, they had looked around at the nations around them essentially and decided to be like them. So there's foreign gods, there's the way that they lived, men and women, and the way that they treated people and the way that they worshiped and did all of these things. And so what would happen, and we see this over and over in the book of Judges, is that the Lord would deliver them into the hands of wicked countries or wicked nations, right? And so at this point by Gideon, they're in the hand of, and nobody in my class will probably get it right. Anybody know who is lording over them? The Midianites, right, exactly. And so they were scared because they couldn't, if they had crops that were prosperous, the Midianites would come in and trample them down, right? If they had cattle or sheep, any kind of herds, they would be taking them, they would destroy them, they would do all these things. And so the people were literally just living in fear. In fact, and I got to get moving here. Oh, gobs of time. When we catch up with Gideon, the angel of the Lord finds Gideon where? He's threshing wheat in anybody know? He's in a wine press, right? Which is probably a hole or a cave, or regardless of where it is specifically, when you do this, you thresh your wheat and you throw up your stuff, right? You throw it up in the air and the chaff blows away and the good stuff falls and you collect it. Well, he didn't want to do this, and the scripture specifically says, if you go back and read in chapter 6, that he did this for fear of the Midianites. That's why he was where he was. So he's literally not where you would normally do this because he's afraid of this other nation that's around them, right? Because they're in bondage to this nation because they just don't have any freedom really, because if they see them prospering or providing for their families, they're going to come in and destroy it. And so the angel of the Lord, which we would teach is the pre-incarnate Jesus, really, comes to Gideon, and he calls him what? Anybody know? Verse 11 of chapter 6, I didn't put this in the system. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." So Gideon is hiding from the Midianites, doing his job here, and the angel shows up and says, "God is with you, you mighty man of valor." And what does Gideon say? He's like, "Man, that's right, I am a mighty man of valor. I can do some stuff." Does he say that? No. He's like, "I think you got the wrong guy." He says, and we're not going to cover all of this because we talked about it in our class last week. We're just kind of getting the backstory. But he says, "I'm of the tribe of Manasseh. We're the least of that, and I'm the least in my family." But before he even says any of that, he says, because he says that God is with you, and Gideon kind of cries out, and he says, "Well, if God's with us, why are we in such bondage? Why are we having all of these difficulties? Why aren't we," essentially what he's saying, because he draws this out, he says, "We have heard the stories of what God has done for our people, and if that's God and he sees us, why is this happening?" Now, if we had read earlier in the chapter, verse 1 says, "The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the land of Midian for 7 years." That's why they were there. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. So that's why what's happening to them is happening to them. But he calls something out of Gideon that Gideon doesn't see, right? And he says that he will go with him. And we didn't have a lot of time last week, but he tells Gideon that he's going to go down and that he is going to use Gideon while he is with Gideon. He says, "I will go with you." Same thing he says to Moses, "I will be with you when you go to do this." And he says, you're going to go and you're going to deliver my people from the hand of the Midianites. And so we know this, a lot of us, if you've been around church for a while, you kind of know the story of, if you live in church world like I do, it's like, well, I'm just going to throw out my fleece. Anybody ever heard that in their life? Which isn't the best approach. Like Jesus tells us to not look for a sign. That's maybe another passage for another lesson for another time. But anyway, so Gideon throws out his fleece and he asks God to do what? Anybody remember? We didn't really talk about this last week. We just referenced it and kept moving because we got to get through Gideon today. So he puts his fleece out on the ground and he asks the Lord, will you give me a sign? And when we come out and get it, let the fleece be wet and the ground is dry. So he comes out in the morning, the fleece is wet, he wrings it out so much that he gets a bowl full of water, it says, right? So then he says, don't be angry with me, Lord. That's what he says. He says, but if I could just test you one more time, and we'll lay the fleece out, and this time, if the fleece is dry and the ground is all dewy around it, like in the morning dew, you know what that's like, but the fleece is completely dry, then, I'll know this is you. It's like the Lord already did something. Well, the Lord obliges again, right? And he throws it out, comes out in the morning, the fleece is dry, the ground is wet, and so Gideon essentially believes now that God is with him. So he goes and calls for an army of all these different tribes, right? He calls for all of these people to come, and they come, the men of valor, so to speak, the men who were trained in these sorts of things. But one quick thing that we're not going to spend a lot of time on is the reason that the people of God, the people of Israel called on God in the first place is only because it got so bad. We talked about that last week. But where Gideon is asking the Lord for all these signs, what we're really seeing here is the grace of God, right? Because the Lord let him do it. I mean, we've all been there. It's like, well, if this happens and then this happens, and we think, well, maybe that'll be a sign from the Lord. And I just don't think that's the best approach. In fact, Jesus tells us it's this, wicked generation that desires a sign. When the Pharisees asked him, well, show us a sign. Prove to us that you are who you say you are. Gives a sign. He's like, well, it's just this wicked and perverse generation, because he really didn't care what people thought about him, apparently. And except be like, well, we don't need a sign. Jesus is like, well, that's you wicked and perverse generation. You want the sign. And so I don't think that really we need to ask God of these signs. Ask these signs of God, I should say. But as we walk through life, what we see in this just brief little encounter that Gideon has with God is Gideon is a man of little faith, right? At this point, he's, God's called him a mighty man, right? But he doesn't see that. And he's like, I just don't know. I just don't know. And the Lord, as gracious and as patient as he is, he shows Gideon a sign. Right? He shows him who he is, and we'll see in a little bit that he actually gives him one more, and some of you probably already know what that is. And, Gideon, he says, am I not sending you? In chapter 6 again, and Gideon says, pardon me, my Lord, but how can I save Israel and all of these things? He's scared. But finally, he recognizes that God is with him, so we'll pick up now in chapter 7, verse 1. It says, then Jerubbaal, now that is Gideon. They renamed Gideon because there's another story we didn't talk about tonight, that the Lord told him to go and tear down the idol or the altar of Baal. And so he does it. The people go after his dad, and they're like, we need Gideon out here right now because he tore down this altar. And so they named him this because he had destroyed that altar of Baal, which was an idol, right? It wasn't God. And so it says, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Herod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So he has an army of 32,000 people, and God says, you have too many people. You get too many people. Tell all the men, say, if you're afraid, you go on home. And literally 22,000 of them leave. So now he has 10,000. And verse 4, but the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you. The same shall go with you, and of whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So he goes from 32,000 men, just like, okay, that's a lot of people. Now, mind you, anybody know, I think we read that in just a little bit here, but anybody know how many there were in the Midianite army? Anybody? 100,000. 100,000. So they were already more than triple what Gideon's army was. And the Lord says, you have way too many men, Gideon. To which I'd be like, are you kidding me? They have 3 to 1. No, we don't. Like, our odds are not good here, God. And so he says, if you go in and defeat them, they're going to say, we delivered ourselves. He said, so tell all the ones that are scared to go home. 22,000 leave. And then God comes back. So Gideon's like, okay, we got 10,000. It's like a 1 to 10, but hey, we'll see what happens. I don't know what's going through his head at this point. But we know he's still fearful at one point because we read that in a moment. But God says, you still have too many. He's like, I still have too many. I mean, I'm saying that. He had to be saying, I still have too many, right? He has seen this other army. So he goes from 10,000 to 300. Come on, those are like the guys that should be like watching the bags or the gear of the 22,000 or the 32,000 that are going to go to war. You need like a couple hundred people just to like stay back and guard your stuff. And he's like, oh, no, you're just going to go in with 300. And so the question is, it's like, is God really asking Gideon, like, I want you to go and defeat 100,000 people. This is, as I just read it, I want you to go and defeat 100,000 people with 300 men. Is that the question that God is asking of Gideon? No. He's saying, I want you, essentially, to prove who I am, who God is, because he'd already told him, I will go with you. He said, I am going to show myself, so it's you, 300 men, and God, right? We see this kind of thought over and over again, and as I was reading it, I was thinking of, Gideon had already mentioned in chapter 6 that, essentially we've heard the stories. Where are you in what we're going through right now? Because we've heard the stories of how you delivered the people out of Egypt. We've heard the stories of how you did all those things. And my thought was, well, how many men did it take God to deliver them out of the most powerful empire at the time? None, really. What did Moses really do? I mean, he had 2 guys, I guess, but it was really God doing the work, right? They come into the promised land eventually, and they're circling the walls of Jericho. How many men tore down those walls? None. God tore down the walls, right? When they're in the wilderness because of their own disobedience for 40 years. The Bible says that their clothes and shoes didn't wear out. I don't know about you. I'm 33, so I've never had any shoes last me 40 years. But, their shoes and their clothing didn't wear out. They were fed bread from heaven. Water came out of rocks. Who did all of that? No man. Right? They had a leader, they had leadership, but they didn't do any of that. And, I'm just like reading this earlier even today, I'm thinking, how many men did it take to trample those walls? How many men did it take to cross an open seas and walk on dry land? How many men did it take to do that? 0. God did that. In fact, when they got to Jericho, the people were already afraid of them, but not because they were afraid of them. They said, we've heard of your God, right? And so God is telling Gideon, he's saying, you're going to go but I'm not going to give you enough men that you guys can take credit for it yourself. God's just showing them who he is. That's what he's about to do. So verse 8, so the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camel were without number as the sand by the seashore in multitude. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. So here we have, the Lord tells him, now I've given this to you. You're going to rise up and go take it. And he says, but if you're afraid, he doesn't say he has to go down. He's like, if you're afraid, just go down in there and see what you hear them talking about, and that will encourage you. So obviously Gideon's afraid because he goes on down to listen, right? And he just overhears these two guys talking. It's like, I had this dream, and I don't really know what it means, but like this thing came in and it falls over and this tent collapses, and the guy's like, oh, that's got to be like about Gideon. Like the Lord's with him. You've heard about Gideon, right? And he's going to come in and he's going to, what are we going to do? And so Gideon, don't you love his response? He doesn't just jump up and go, all right, we got him. Let's go get our 300 and we're going to go and surround him and take him out. He stops, and it says he worshiped. Because again, the Lord has given him this sign, and it's not Gideon so much that they're afraid of, is it? It says, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand, God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. It's not because Gideon's mighty. It's because they somehow already knew that God was with him, which is like sort of mind-boggling to think about. Because again, we know Gideon is not necessarily a well-known fella before this, right? Because he says, I'm like the least of my family. I'm not really that big of a deal. So we catch back up here, verse 16. Then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, Look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say, The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outposts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch.